thank you, Patrick, for inviting me. I am truly honored to be a part of this conference. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed care this afternoon, which some of you may already be familiar with. I'm Shamere Mackenzie, and I hold several titles. One of the things that I hate to do is introduce myself because I'm like, does it matter, right? All I want to say is I'm Shamere Mackenzie, and I'm a human being, because that's, to me, is what matters the most. All these other titles, you guys can read from the slide on the screen. My most important title is that I'm Shamere Mackenzie, and I'm a human being, right? So let's get into our presentation this afternoon. We're going to talk about trauma-informed care. And before I get into that, I really want us to understand trauma. Before we get into trauma-informed care, sometimes it's like a buzzword in different spaces, right? Trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care. And then when you should ask people, well, what is trauma-informed care? They're like, people get stuck. So let's do a little case study here, right? Who can read this slide for me, please? Someone? Go ahead, Brianna. You look like you were going right into it.
Sure. So Andrew grew up with a physically, sexually, and emotionally abusive father, responded to his home life through self-harming behaviors and contemplating suicide, ran away from home at 14, coerced into sex trafficking by an acquaintance who used violence and the threat of harming his siblings to force him to cooperate, contracted HIV, and wants to commit suicide.
Thank you, Brianna. So I have a couple questions for you. Has this patient experienced trauma? See Rax saying yes. I see Timo saying yes.
Definitely.
Right? What indicators might be present that would suggest that this individual has been impacted by trauma?
The physically and the sexually abusive father.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else?
How he responded.
How
he responded to his the response.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else?
HIV diagnosis.
Can you repeat that?
The HIV diagnosis.
The HIV diagnosis. Okay. Anything else that we're seeing here?
Sex trafficking.
The sex trafficking, right? And then we are seeing this individual, he wants to commit suicide. Where is that coming from, right? We also see that this individual ran away from home, right? And we understand that when people run away from home, they're either running from something or running to something, right? I work with law enforcement a lot, and I have law enforcement officers that says, oh, they used to hate runaways when they first started doing this work, right? Because they saw them as problem kids until they understood trauma that these kids are either running away from something or running to something. What are some strategies that you would implement to support Andrew in managing his response to this situation? Someone said counseling, yes.
Probably develop like a safety plan for like suicidal ideations.
Safety plan for the suicidal ideations. Great. Anyone else? Suicide prevention services. Thank you, Laura.
Some safe housing.
Some safe
housing.
Some safe housing. Some safe housing environment. Anything else?
Treatment for his HIV diagnosis.
Treatment for the HIV diagnosis. Someone said support group. Anything else that you would implement? And for the person who said counseling, we know we have different types of counseling, right? One second. No, I'm working from home, so the house phone is ringing. Right, bear with me. All right, So these are just some strategies, all right? The person who said counseling, we know we have different types of counseling that he can access. I see people are putting a mentor, peer support, care, case management, resources to get a job, housing, food. So I'm seeing from this group that you guys have different strategies that you would use to help Andrew, right? But let's define what trauma is. What is trauma, right? An individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being, right? My friends like to think that I am a psychologist or a therapist. I am none of the above, right? I just like people. And in loving people, you have to understand that people, like, I remember being younger and being in the supermarket sometimes and be like, you know, wanting to fight people sometimes just because of how they respond to you, right? And now that I grow up and I see certain responses, I chalk it all up to trauma. Right? When I see some behaviors and I'm like, oh, that's not too nice, right? I'm like, oh, that person must have experienced some trauma, and that's a response, right? That's a traumatic response, right? That behavior is a traumatic response. I don't know. I chalk it all up to trauma, right? Saying, you know what, Shamere, show them a little bit more grace. They may have had a traumatic experience that is causing them to behave in such a way, right? So who experiences trauma? 61% of men and 51% of women, according to this study that was done in January 2020, right? 61% of men, right? And we have men sometimes who walk around and they're like, I'm so macho, I'm good. Nothing's wrong with me, I'm good, right? And then sometimes we use things like, what do we say to our males? Man up. Right? That's causing them to suppress that trauma, not able to come forward and say, you know what, I've had a tough day or had these things happen, because we have these societal influences, right? So some people will look at this side and say 61% of men, the number for men is higher. I would argue that females would be higher, right? But we have these sources of influence in our culture, right? That causes our men to be like, no, I gotta man up. I gotta put on this macho, not allowing men to come forth and express how they honestly feel without being judged, right? But then we see 51% of women. So let's look at complex trauma, if my slides will work with me here, right? When we talk about complex trauma, this is where sometimes, you know, I hear people say, well, there's trauma, and we have to understand there's different levels to trauma, right? Complex trauma is a type of trauma that occurs repeatedly, right? This is happening over and over, right? Or they're in a situation, there's one traumatic event, another traumatic event happens, right? And before they can even process the first event, another one is happening. Right? And this could be in specific relationships or in specific contexts, right? You have layers and layers and layers of trauma that's happening before they're able to process the first one or the second one, right? So that's what we look at as complex trauma. So when we're looking at trauma in itself, that could be a single traumatic event, right? But complex trauma, it's just think of multiple. Right? I like to use simple terms for these things, right? So just think of multiple traumatic events happening before a person is able to even process the first one, right? The way trauma impacts individuals depends on many different factors, right? And we do understand that there are lack of resources for these factors that calls for a structural intervention. Right? So trauma can impact someone's history and the background of the individual, the history and the background of the individual, right? Previous history of trauma, right? Details of a traumatic event that can impact a person, Resources available in the direct aftermath of the trauma. If there are no resources available to me to cope, to handle this type of stuff, that can be damaging. The meaning of specific trauma events for individual, family, and community. Sometimes people don't relate. Sometimes people don't understand, right? How many times have you been in a situation and someone close to you may have shared and they said, oh, get over it, it'll be okay. How do you know it's going to be okay? It may be okay for you, but it may not be okay for someone else, right? And I hate when people say, oh, get over it. You may be able to get over it, but this person here who's had this experience may not be able to just get over it because they may not have the tools and the resources that you may have access to get over whatever the situation is. I want us to take a good look at the brain. This is the neurobiology of trauma. And this is a slide that I wish I could just walk around with on my phone and just show people. Right? Sometimes people think individuals who have experienced trauma, like they can control the way they respond to things, right? I wish I can control the way I respond to certain traumatic events in my life. I can't say, hey, tonight you're going to sleep, right? The brain is impacted in a way that the person may not even be able. See, someone put it in the chat. In the Hispanic community, a man is supposed to always keep it together. Why? Why can't men express themselves, right? But on this slide here, we are seeing, right? We're seeing two images here that I really want you to take a close look at, right? We're seeing on the left side is what we consider a healthy brain, a brain that has not been impacted by trauma. On the right side is a brain that has been impacted by trauma. And if you look at the areas that are circled, you will see on the left side, you will see a lot of red and yellow, right? Where on the left side, it's black. That shows the inactivity in the brain that has been impacted by trauma. Now, you can't go into your brain and say, hey, brain, give me more brain activity over here, right? This is something that has a natural process, right? When we have our brains, we know we have different parts of the brains. The amygdala is the part of the brain that senses stress and it responds a certain way. And then the prefrontal cortex is supposed to process, right, that response. But if we have a brain, right, that has a trauma brain, right, we don't have those activity in that brain to help that person process, to help them respond in the way that we want to see them, to help them respond in the way that when I was younger that I wanted to fight. So now when I look at, when I see these behaviors, this image comes to mind. Hey, Shamere, remember, their brain, they can't control what's happening in the brain. That's a natural biological response to trauma, right? But the brain is very resilient, right? There are several tools out there. There are several ways that you can retrain the brain to respond to trauma and redevelop the brain. I have gone through one myself. It's hard, it's tough, it's difficult, but if you want that healing that you're really looking for, you will be committed to doing the exercise and retraining the brain, right? That has been impacted by trauma. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. I'm also monitoring the chat. So if you post your questions in the chat, I'll also see that, right? So trauma responses, right? After a person experiences a traumatic event, right? This could be human trafficking. This could, and most of my slides you'll see refer to human trafficking. That's the field that I'm in, right? It could be human trafficking. It could be a death, right? Even a death of an animal, right? The way they think, feel, behave, and even physically respond is called a trauma response, right? And this varies among people. You can have individuals who experience the same thing and respond in different ways, right? Any trauma, regardless of whether it's a single event, repetitive, or long-term series of events, will impact people differently, right? That's why some of us can say, oh, my animal died, I buried it, that's it, I move along. While some people, it takes weeks, it takes months for them to understand they had to bury their pet, right? The way someone responds to trauma may change over a time and often depends on the type of support and trauma-informed care the individual receives in the aftermath of that trauma. Right? So if you had a traumatic event and you went and you got counseling and you got some tools in your toolbox as to how to respond to that, you're like, okay, before when I didn't have the support, I may have responded this way, but now I have some tools in my toolbox to say, hey, the next time this thing happens, I'm going to respond. I'm going to reach out to my support system. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to breathe, do some breathing exercises, right? There's so many ways that you can respond. Now the person has a tool in their toolbox, they can respond differently because of that support that they may have received, right? Common trauma responses that we see, right? Physical, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. When we're talking about that physical response, that could show up as low energy, paleness, someone who's lethargic, headaches, right? Even digestive complaints, right? Because when we're talking about trauma, understand that there's a great book out there called The Body Keeps the Score. And if you guys haven't read that book, I would suggest how, sometimes we go through different experiences and we're not really understanding how it impacts the physical body, right? Trauma also have an emotional response, right? This is when we may see anxiety, emotional numbness, anger, depression, guilt, shame, avoidance, right? It has some behavioral responses, right? This is where we may see individuals turn to substance or alcohol use, eating disorders, compulsive behaviors, right? Or even isolation and detachment from others. That's a trauma response, right? And of course, the cognitive, right? We're talking about things like memory lapses, the inability to concentrate, right? Flashbacks, right? Increased distraction, things like that, right? Any questions so far? And then these are some of the things that you may see in the people that you have the privilege to serve who have experienced trauma, right? These are when we're talking about individuals who have unresolved trauma, right? So they've had a traumatic event and it has not been addressed, right? So this person is just living, right? And I used to say prior to the pandemic, right? If you haven't experienced trauma, you probably just haven't lived long enough yet. Well, we know like most of America have experienced some trauma coming out of this pandemic. Whether that's isolation, some of us, we love to be around our families that help us to get through. We weren't able to be around our families, right? Listen, mental health cases went up. Mental health workers, their caseload increased coming out of this pandemic, right? We may also see individuals with untreated symptomologies, right? Or unhealthy coping techniques, right? Because some of it is, how many of you have ever had an experience, right? And you go to your girlfriend, right? Or a friend, and you're saying, hey, I've had this experience, and they give you advice on how to deal with it. And it may not be a healthy way to cope with that situation, but that's what you are. It may not even be your girlfriend. It could be your parents. Listen, I'm Jamaican, right? And in my culture, some of the coping mechanisms it's very different from other cultures. I remember growing up and my mother used to spank me, right? And when she spanked me and I cry, she used to tell me to stop crying before she gives me something to cry for. You just spanked me. Of course I'm going to cry, right? So some of the coping mechanisms that we have learned maybe from cultural practices, or sometimes it's not even cultural. Sometimes it's just who is in our circle that's providing us with this advice. It may not be the right coping mechanism, right? That's why I always tell people, try to get some professional help, right? Yes, Pedro, with Hispanic experience, similar culture, Pedro, similar culture there, right? A similar culture. And so these are some of the ways that you may see trauma in with the individuals that you have the privilege to serve. When we talk about trauma, there's also some compounding factors, right? Many of the people that you serve, many of your clients may have had multiple or repeated contacts with various systems over the course of their lives, right? They may have negative contacts with some of these systems or providers who have been unsuccessful in helping them, right? And that may cause them to respond to some of these systems differently. And when we're talking about systems, we may be talking about housing, mental health, the criminal justice system, employment, education, training, things of that nature, right? So let's do a quick knowledge check, right? We're going back to this scenario with Andrew. That's a scenario we're going to use throughout this presentation. So Andrew began to experience traumatic events as a young child. Trauma that occurs repeatedly over a period of time and within specific relationships and contexts. What is this called? Is that called a traumatic event, post-traumatic stress, or complex trauma? You can type it in the chat or say it out loud. Let's see what people are saying in the chat. We had one person say complex trauma. I need about 3 more responses. Complex, complex, complex. Some people say, so let's read this example again. Andrew began to experience traumatic events as a young child. Trauma that occurs repeatedly over a period of time and within specific relationship and context is called, that of course is called complex trauma, right? That is complex trauma. So it's occurring repeatedly over a period of time. So let's look at trauma-informed care. We're going back to this case study of Andrew, right? A social worker visited Andrew's apartment to perform a child welfare check. Noticing scars on Andrew's arms, bruises on his legs, and dark circles around his eyes, the social worker asked Andrew if he was being abused. Fear retaliation from his mother, Andrew lied and said he wasn't. The social worker gave Andrew a referral to a substance abuse treatment program, even though Andrew informed her he wasn't using substances. Do you think this is a trauma-informed approach? Sarah said no. Laura said no. Why do you guys, Gloria said no. Why do you guys say no? Why isn't this Debbie said no. Why isn't this? You can unmute and talk to me. I love to hear people's voices. You can unmute and talk to me. Why isn't this a trauma-informed approach? You can also type it in the chat if you're a little bit shy like I used to be. Why isn't this a trauma-informed approach? Jake, you want to give this a shot?
Yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with what's already said. I think it might not be. I think it is assumed to have probably in his eyes to have been a response or information given, but I don't think it would fall under that category.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Alicia. Thank you, Jake. Go ahead, Alicia.
Hi. Yeah, I just think that the approach is sort of like that the social worker seems to think that they know what's going on, even though they don't really. It doesn't seem to be like a lot of like just offering space for like safe psychological safety for Andrew and like how Andrew might approach the situation. Also giving a referral to a substance abuse treatment program, even though Andrew said they weren't using substances. It just doesn't feel like there's a lot of trust that's being built here. So,
right. So, and some of you are hitting the nail on the head here. So Tessa said, treatment not related to the root cause of the problem, right? Closing the case after hearing no, not looking further into it, what other indicators that could suggest abuse, etc. Also looking into health backgrounds overall, could be that it isn't abuse, but important to really investigate. So the last bullet here says the social worker gave Andrew a referral to a substance abuse treatment program, even though Andrew informed her he wasn't using substances. That's not a trauma-informed approach, right? The first step in our trauma-informed approach is to listen, is to understand what our clients are saying, right? So that we can make the appropriate referral. We can't go in thinking, listen, I went to the best university that exists in the United States, right? You don't know where I studied, Shamere, so I know what's going on. We understand that each client is different, right? Each individual is different. Each experience is different. That comes with various nuances, right? And we have to respond accordingly. Andrew said he wasn't using a substance. Why are we sending him to a substance abuse treatment program? Right? That doesn't make sense. So let's look at this trauma-informed care, right? Trauma-informed care. This can be implemented in any type of service setting or organization, and is distinct from trauma-specific interventions or treatments that are designed specifically to address the consequences of trauma and facilitate healing. Notice that last part, and facilitate healing. Because what we want when individuals experience trauma is not only for them to have this experience and say, hey, they have these tools to respond, but for them to begin to heal and grow from that experience, right? So let's look at this definition, right? Trauma-informed care is an approach to engage in people with histories of trauma that recognize the presence of trauma, symptoms, and acknowledge the role that trauma has played in their lives, right? It includes changing organizations so that all individuals, right, that come in contact with any aspect of the agency is assessed and modified, if necessary, to include basic understanding of how trauma affects the life of an individual seeking services. I can't tell you how many trainings I've given on trauma, and I've heard people say, the client came in and they didn't address me by my proper name, especially individuals who are dealing with young people, right? I remember doing a training for Department of Health and Department of Health and Human Services, and the lady said she was dealing with a client and he came in and he said, yo, what's up? And she did not engage with the youth because the youth said, yo, what's up? And I said, so why did you engage? And she said, I am Mrs. So-and-so and I am the director of this and this. The youth don't care about your title. You are lucky he even acknowledged you. And some of the times we don't even think that individuals may have been taught differently from us. They may have been from different walks. So in my culture, even in going to school in the Caribbean, when a teacher steps in the room, you have to stand up and you have to acknowledge the teacher by their last name, right? And you have to say, as soon as the teacher walks into the classroom, you have to stand up and say, good afternoon, Miss Mackenzie, right? In the US, that's a little different, right? The way people are raised, it's different. Right? So in that youth's mind, by acknowledging, saying, yo, what up? They may be thinking they're saying good morning. Not everybody's going to come and say, good morning, Madam Director so-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. But how about, and I said to her, how about you build rapport with that youth and then teach the youth the proper way versus dismissing him and then criticizing him, right? So what are the goals of trauma-informed care? It's to infuse acknowledgement of the impact of trauma on clients in all aspects of your program. It's to build rapport, trust, and a sense of safety, right? And it's to ensure that clients are not re-victimized in the process of seeking help, which sometimes happen when agencies just throw out this trauma-informed language and say they practice trauma-informed care, but when people present behaviors related to their trauma, they kick them out of their programs or kick them out of the agency. but then you say you follow trauma-informed principles. We need to check that. We need to check that. What are some of the challenges, right? To overcome institutional roadblocks and to translate this philosophy into practice, right? We have to ensure that agencies have access to training, right? You have to look into your intake forms used for services. You have to hire individuals with lived experience related to the service that you're serving to help inform your agency. Understand how trauma may manifest with individuals with lived experiences and have policies in place to respond to that, right? Have policies in place to respond to that. Trauma-informed approach. What's this trauma-informed approach here, right? You have to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the potential pathways for recovery. You want to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in individuals, families, staff, and other individuals involved in the system. You want to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seek to actively resist re-traumatization. There is this, Samsha has identified 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care, right? We look at safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender considerations. When we're talking about safety, we're talking about providing a welcoming environment, right? Be sensitive to potential triggers that may remind individuals of past trauma, right? Don't pressure an individual into answering questions if they hesitate, right? And to follow the golden rule, be kind, right? The individuals that you may serve in may be belligerent, they may be hostile. That doesn't mean that you should change. Still be kind to these individuals. Try to remember that their experiences and past traumatizations make it difficult for them to trust agencies and care providers, especially people in authority, right? When we're talking about trustworthiness and transparency, we want to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. You want to clarify your role, obtain informed consent, right? And you want to be consistent and understand it takes time to build trust, right? Peer support is very important. Engaging peers with empathy, respect, and support, providing meaningful opportunities for peers to facilitate, organize, or even coordinate activities, right? And hire individuals with lived experience with the appropriate skills to mentor individuals that you serve, right? When we're talking about collaboration and mutuality, right? Maximize opportunities for collaboration and the sharing of power between staff and your clients, right? Recognize that everyone has a role to play in the trauma-informed care. One does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, right? And when we talk about empowerment, voice, and choice, listen, empowerment starts at the very beginning, right? There should be pictures in your spaces to reflect empowerment, right? I used to run a residential facility, and when I was working with the designers in designing this facility, I told my designers, listen, I want my favorite quote right at the front door over the arch. When someone walks in, you know, when you walk into a space, the first thing you do if you don't know it, you start looking around like, where am I? And in that space, I used my favorite quote, you are destined for greatness. And I told my staff, before you guys open your mouth, the person walking into our facility should know that we care. We are here for them. So we don't have pictures in the facility that represent what we are serving, right? Imagine if you're a woman who has suffered domestic violence and walk into a facility and see a picture of a woman beaten up. That's triggering. You don't want to see that, right? So empowerment, giving these individuals a voice, allowing them to share, right? And be transparent in explaining options and your role And most importantly, respect their decisions, respect their choice, even if you disagree, right? Respect their choice and understand that there's some cultural, historical, and gender considerations, right? That is the piece. You know, I'm a big fan of culture, right? When I meet someone, that's my first question. Where are you from? And people are like, I'm from America. I'm like, no. You have an accent. I have an accent too. Where are you from? Right? And I want to learn at least one word in their culture, right? And then I go around for the rest of the week thinking I'm from that culture with the one word that I've learned. And don't let me interact with someone who's from that culture, right? So like the other day, there were these Latino men that were paving my mom's driveway. And I walked up, hola, ¿cómo está? And of course, they started speaking to me in Spanish. And I'm like, un poquito. But because I was so excited to practice my Spanish, right? And I'm going all up to them all excited, like, hola, ¿cómo está? They're thinking, right? Because it breaks the ice, right? So understand that there may be cultural, historical, or gender considerations, right? You may have to translate information for people. Right? Not everyone is going to translate information. Not everyone is going to speak English. Make sure that the information that you're providing is in another language. Make sure you have interpreters and respect cultural identity and practices. We're here in America where we do things differently sometimes, right? And different cultures, they have various practices and various identity, and we should respect that. And even if you don't know, ask about it. Try to learn, try to understand where this person is coming from, right? I'm moving quite along because I have 5 minutes left and I'm only halfway through this presentation, right? Tips for trauma response management, psychoeducation, sensory-based grounding tools, self-soothing relaxation skills, active listening, active and compassionate listening. I'm going to go through this real quick, right? When we talk about psychoeducation, we want to inform the individuals about their experiences, right? The definition of trauma, myths of trauma, right? Common responses to trauma. We want to help people understand their trauma, right? Ways to address their immediate safety and self-care needs. Someone stay in the track. See you later, Timo. Right, so these are some of what we talk about psychoeducation. When we're talking about sensory-based grounding tools, right? These could be tactile items such as stress balls, pipe cleaners, fidget toys, essential oils, or even tea or water, right? Self-soothing relaxation skills. We're talking about mindfulness, deep breathing exercise, movement-based skills. Right? The Sonar Institute, I love promoting Sonar Institute, right? On their website, they have some resources for self-soothing and relaxation skills. And of course, we want to practice some active and compassionate listening techniques. When you're interacting with your clients, you shouldn't be on your phone. Right? You shouldn't be distracted by other things. You want to mirror empowering language of the individual, right? You want to practice some empathetic and patient communication, right? I train people how to respond to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And when I'm training our advocates, I'm like, listen, if someone tells you something like, hey, I have been raped or something, follow up with a compassionate statement. I'm sorry you have experienced that. That must be hard because sometimes we're just tunnel vision in collecting notes and checking off the boxes that we're not really hearing what the person is saying and providing that compassionate response that's needed in that moment. Sometimes you may be the first person that this person is sharing this experience with, and they just need a little support, someone to show them a little compassion, a little kindness can go a long way. And if we follow the golden rule in treating people the way we want to be treated, we can't go wrong, right? Some basic trauma-informed interventions, and I'm going to just go through this real quick. outreach and engagement. How are we reaching these individuals? How are we responding to crisis interventions, right? That requires the appropriate training. How are we providing support to the parents of individuals who have experienced trauma, right? What is our screening and assessment process like, right? To help individuals identify trauma and to give a clear picture of what's needed, right? Do we have mental health and substance abuse services available? Do we have resource coordination and advocacy, right? Someone who can help them navigate services in their area, trauma-specific services, right? Services that are specific to this individual's trauma, right? So we're not gonna do the example like Andrew and be that caseworker that put him in a substance abuse program when he told her, I don't have a substance use, right? And of course, healthcare is very important, right? When we're talking about this, there could be that physical, remember the body, there's also that physical component of trauma. Other intervention, movement and art-based interventions, right? There could be body-based group interventions. There's a group here that's called STARS that use this model to address complex trauma. And I'm going through this very fast, right? And then there's trauma-specific psychological interventions, right? This is where we're talking about EMDR, right? The CBT model, right? Narrative therapy, trauma-sensitive yoga, right? Things like that. And of course, we want to look at a person-centered response, right? Their wishes. What are their wishes, right? What are some of their safety concerns? And of course, their well-being. Seek to understand what they want, what they're asking, respect their choices, right? Take time to understand their perception of how they want to improve their well-being. Support their autonomy by offering choices whenever possible, right? And be aware of your verbal and nonverbal cues, right? This was supposed to be a poll. If you're ready, if you believe that you're ready to serve trauma-involved individuals who have experienced trauma. Do people think that they're ready? Yes, people think that they're ready, right? Yes, I will share this PowerPoint afterwards. But I want to know, what has your organization done to have you believe that, and Patrick, are you here? I know I'm at 3:45.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I am. Yes. You
Patrick,
find, yes,
okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear from people. So everybody's saying that they believe that they are ready to serve individuals who have experienced trauma. Now I want you to answer this question. What has your organization done for you to believe that you are ready to serve individuals who have experienced trauma? Or what have you personally done? You don't have to answer this publicly. I am going to give you some time, right? I'm going to stop sharing and then share again to have my sound. I'm going to give you some time to think about it. Right? I've seen different people say they've done some assessments, they've been encouraged to get information and share with trainings like this. Okay, right? I want you to think about the good, the bad, and the ugly when we're talking about serving individuals with trauma, right? And sometimes a short walk down memory lane is all it takes for us to appreciate where we are today, because we may have experienced some trauma, we may have gotten some help, and the individual that we are serving may be in the same place that we were at years ago, and it just needs some support like we too need, right?
Mhm.
Is this how you're showing up at work? Brianna said yes. Does this image resonate with you? You show up at work with a cape on, and you think you're Superman or Superwoman, and you are going to rescue some people, huh? So I want to know, does this image resonate with you? Why did you get involved in this work? Why is it that you chose this specific field? I see some people are saying, yes, the full outfit. Okay. So you think you're ready, huh? But if we're really ready to serve individuals with trauma, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Have you taken off your cape? Because if you show up to work like this, you're putting yourself at the center versus the individual that you're serving at the center. You're making this about you when you wear this cape, showing up saying, I'm going to rescue someone, not understanding that this person is very resilient, right? You're just walking alongside this person, right? So we should not be showing up to work with the cape, right? We need to take off our cape, right? Have you checked your ego? Because sometimes our ego get in the way of service, right? I told y'all that one example. We want to be called director so-and-so versus serving. That's how I start my presentation the way I did. I don't care about the titles, right? I'm a human being and I'm going to serve from that place of humanity, right? I got you, Patrick. Have you checked your privileges? Have you checked your biases? Have you checked your prejudices? Is the dollar your bottom line? Do you have written policies in place? Are you just checking the box? Do you believe people who have experienced trauma are difficult to work with? And can you see people beyond their trauma? I want to ask all of you to join me right now and follow the motion on the screen and take off your cape. Some of you who said this is how you show up, follow the motion on your screen and just take off the cape. Take it off. Take it off. That's not how we're going to show up to serve people who serve trauma anymore. We're going to take it off, right? So we are ready to serve. We are ready to serve these people who have experienced trauma, and we're going to understand. This is a slide that you can read on your own of just how to serve individuals, right? I want you to take a look on your environment, like I touched on before, right? Here's some negative images. I told you I'm in the human trafficking field. These are some negative images that I have seen in response to my field, right? Here's some positive images. Remember I told you in the place that I work, there was that sign, you're destined for greatness. There it is. Here's a brochure that looks inviting, welcoming, right? Here's another one, right? Inviting, welcoming, right? So here's a little recap, right? Take off your cape, check yourself for your biases, prejudice, etc. Get some psychoeducation. Imagery is important, whether that's on your brochures, your website, your surroundings. Have written policies in place for clients and staff, and self-care. Do keep in mind that there is a bright light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope for individuals who have experienced trauma, right? I'm sorry I had to rush through this, but this is my contact information where you can reach me. I'm gonna, Patrick has the slide, and Patrick, you could go ahead and share the slides with individuals. I know I rushed through some parts, but I thank you all for allowing me to go over a little bit and for being here today with you. Brianna and Jake, thank you so much for being on the screen with me so I didn't feel like I'm talking to a computer. And thank you to everyone who was participating in the chat. It was truly a pleasure. Patrick, thank you so much.
Shamere, thank you so much.